Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. So today we're tackling global population trends, focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa. And we've got a really fascinating study to dig into from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's all about the link between educating women and, get this, fertility rates.
Yeah.
At first glance, it might not sound like the most thrilling topic, but trust me, this is going to be good.
Oh, yeah, this study is really something else. I mean, the researchers looked at data from 39 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and what they found was pretty amazing. Higher education levels for women basically always mean lower fertility rates across the board.
Yeah, that makes sense at first glance, right?
Right.
I mean, more education usually means better jobs.
Yeah.
And better jobs mean more financial security. So maybe women are just choosing to have smaller families because they've got more options now.
Well, sure, there's definitely an economic angle to it, but the study suggests that it goes deeper than that. It's like education actually impacts how people think and make decisions. The more educated a woman is, the better she is at planning for the future and thinking critically, and just considering a wider range of possibilities for her life.
So it's not just about practical stuff, right? It's about like a fundamental shift in how women see themselves and what their futures could be.
Exactly. And you know what's really interesting? The researchers actually built a forecasting model based on these education levels to predict fertility trends and population growth, and it was incredibly accurate.
Whoa, hold on. So they could actually predict how many kids women would have and how fast the population would grow just by looking at education levels.
Pretty much, yeah. It just goes to show how important education is in shaping these big trends.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this strong connection between education and fertility rates.
Yeah.
What else did this study find?
Well, one of the coolest things I discovered was this idea of diffusion. It basically means that even women without formal education are still influenced by what the more educated women are doing.
Okay, I need an example here. How does that actually play out in real life?
All right, well, the study talks about Ethiopia. There's been this huge shift in family size over there in the last few decades. Back in the 60s, the average woman had something like 7 children. Now that number is down to 4.5. But here's the thing that's really interesting. That decline in fertility rates happened across all levels of education, not just among the highly educated women.
So you're saying that women who weren't as educated saw their educated peers having smaller families, and they kind of started making similar choices themselves.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this ripple effect. And we see a similar trend in Kenya, too. Their fertility rates have dropped from over 8 kids per woman in the 70s to just 3 now.
Wow.
So this diffusion thing, it means that educating women has a much bigger impact than you might think at first. It's not just about those individual women. It's about changing expectations and norms for everyone.
That's really powerful. It's like investing in education for one woman actually ends up benefiting her whole community. But hold on a sec. What about the places where this isn't happening as much? You mentioned regional differences earlier.
Oh, yeah, you're right. There are definitely some variations across sub-Saharan Africa. Like Southern Africa, they're kind of leading the way right now, both in terms of how much education women are getting and how much fertility rates are declining. Countries like South Africa and Botswana, they have the lowest average fertility rates in the whole region, somewhere between 2 and 3 children per woman.
Okay, so Southern Africa's ahead of the game. What about the regions that are falling behind?
Well, Western and Central Africa tend to have lower levels of education for women, and as a result, their fertility rates are higher. And that raises a bunch of new questions, like what's causing these differences? Are there cultural barriers or economic factors at play? And how can we learn from the places that are doing better?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. We're not just looking at numbers on a page. We're trying to understand the complicated forces that shape these trends. But before we move on too far, I want to unpack this whole diffusion thing a little bit more. I'm still trying to get my head around how it works in practice.
Well, picture it like this. Imagine. It's not like someone is telling them what to do. It's more like what's considered normal starts to change. You're less likely to try some new food if no one else is eating it right. But if all your friends are saying it's amazing, well, then you might be more open to trying it. It's kind of the same with family size. When women see their friends and family who are educated, having smaller families and doing well, it makes them start to rethink what they thought was normal.
So it's like a real-life example of what's possible right there in their own community.
Exactly. And this is where the study gets even more interesting. They found that this diffusion thing is even stronger in places with high social capital.
Wait, what's social capital?
Oh, it just means like the networks of relationships and trust that exist in a community, like how connected people are and the resources they can share and access through those connections. So basically, in this study, it means that the impact of educated women goes beyond just their immediate family and friends. They become these influential figures in their communities. And people really pay attention to what they do and the choices they make.
So it's not just about individual choices. It's about how those choices spread outwards and change the mindset of the whole community.
That's exactly it. And that's why this diffusion thing is so powerful. It's not about forcing change from the top down. It's about creating a space where new ideas and behaviors can grow naturally.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm still curious about those regional differences we talked about. Why is Southern Africa so ahead of the curve, and Western and Central Africa are lagging behind? Does the study give any clues about that?
Well, it's a complicated issue, but the study seems to suggest that government policies and investments play a big role. Countries that prioritize girls' education and make it affordable and accessible, they tend to see more progress both in education levels and in lower fertility rates.
So it's not just about talking the talk, right? It's about putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. And it's about tackling the underlying social and cultural barriers that keep girls out of school. Things like child marriage and poverty and gender discrimination. All of that creates huge obstacles.
It's a reminder that education is more than just building schools. It's about creating an environment where girls can thrive.
Yeah, you need to make sure girls feel valued and empowered, and that they have the resources they need to succeed.
That makes sense. But even with all those challenges, the potential for positive change is still pretty exciting, right?
Absolutely. This study gives us a lot to think about. If something as simple as seeing what your peers are doing can have such a huge impact, imagine what we could accomplish if we really focused on harnessing this diffusion effect.
So we've talked about how education affects the number of kids women have. But does it impact other parts of family planning and reproductive health?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And the study touches on that too. One thing they found was that education helps women make more informed choices about their reproductive health in general. They're more likely to use contraception and to get prenatal care. And they can make decisions about family planning that actually align with their own goals and desires.
So it's not just about having fewer kids, it's about having more control over your own body and your own life.
Exactly. And that's where we start to see the bigger implications of educating women. It's not just about fertility rates. It's about empowering women to make choices that improve their lives and their families' lives.
Right. I see the connections here. We've talked about the impact on fertility rates and the diffusion effect and how important government policies are. But I'm curious about the individual women themselves. How does education change their lives outside of family planning?
Well, that's a really key point. The study highlights how transformative education can be for women on a personal level. Educated women are more likely to join the workforce and contribute to their communities and break the cycle of poverty. They gain confidence and critical thinking skills, and they develop a sense of agency that allows them to shape their own destinies.
It's like that saying, educate a girl and you educate a nation. The ripple effects are incredible. But before we get too carried away with all the positive stuff, I think it's important to acknowledge that there might be challenges too. We touched on this briefly in the outline, but could we dive a little deeper into that?
Sure, the study mostly focuses on the good things about female education. But it does admit that promoting education isn't some magic solution. There can be unintended consequences or challenges that need to be addressed carefully.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of challenges are we talking about?
Well, for example, some critics worry that a really fast drop in fertility rates could lead to an aging population, and that could mean a shrinking workforce, which could have consequences for economic growth and social stability. We need to think about how to manage those demographic shifts in a smart way.
So it's not just about encouraging women to have fewer kids. It's about creating a sustainable balance that benefits both individuals and society as a whole. What else should we be thinking about?
Another important thing is to make sure we're using culturally sensitive approaches. Promoting education should never be about forcing external values or disrupting traditional ways of life. It's about working with communities to make sure that education programs are actually meeting their needs and respecting their aspirations.
Right, it's about empowering women to make their own choices, not telling them what they should be choosing. But with all these complexities in mind, how can we actually use this knowledge about education and diffusion to create positive change on a bigger scale? What are the key takeaways for policymakers and organizations working in this area?
That's a great question to wrap up this part of our deep dive. I think the most important takeaway is that investing in girls' education isn't just the right thing to do. It's also a really smart and strategic investment in a better future for everyone. It's about realizing that empowering women isn't just a social good. It's crucial for achieving broader economic, social, and environmental goals.
And I think the study also shows us how powerful this diffusion effect is.
Mhm.
It shows us that positive change can happen organically through the influence of social networks and role models. But we can't just sit back and wait for it to happen on its own.
Exactly. We need to be proactive. We need to create environments where girls can thrive and where education is valued and where women have the power to make their own choices.
This has been a really insightful conversation, but before we wrap things up completely, I want to touch on one more thing. We've talked a lot about the big picture impact of education, but what about the personal stories? What about the individual women whose lives have been changed by access to education?
That's an excellent point. It's easy to get caught up in the statistics, but we need to remember that behind those numbers are real people with real stories. Think about a young woman in a rural village who, because of education, can now read and write and access information that she couldn't before. Or imagine a mother who can better care for her children's health and advocate for them, all because she got an education. Those are the stories that really bring this research to life.
Yeah, and those stories remind us why this work is so important. It's not just about trends and numbers. It's about creating a world where every girl has the chance to reach her full potential and make her own unique contribution to society.
Exactly. And those individual stories of empowerment and transformation are what ultimately drive lasting change. It's those stories that really make this research come alive. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about something else, too. We've been talking about access to education, but what about the quality of that education? Does the study talk about what kinds of learning experiences are most effective? Like, what really makes a difference?
That's a great question. The study doesn't really get into specifics about curriculum or teaching methods, but they do say that education, especially at the higher levels like secondary and tertiary, it seems to be really important for developing critical thinking and decision-making skills.
So it's not just about memorizing facts or learning how to read and write. It's about being able to analyze information and make choices that align with your own values.
Exactly. And I think that's where the real magic of education happens. It's not just about giving people information. It's about giving them the power to be active participants in their own lives.
Which kind of brings us back to that diffusion idea. The more women are able to think critically and make informed decisions, the more likely they are to influence the people around them.
Right. It's like a chain reaction. Education empowers women. Empowered women make different choices. Those choices change social norms. And then those changing norms create a better environment for even more progress.
And what's so great about this study is that it actually gives us evidence to support something we've kind of known all along. Educating women is one of the best ways to make the world a better place.
I totally agree. It's not just a nice idea, it's a strategy that's backed by real data. And when you combine that data with those personal stories of empowerment, it makes a really strong case for prioritizing girls' education everywhere.
We've talked about so much in this deep dive. The link between education and fertility rates, the whole diffusion thing, the differences between regions, the challenges that come up. If you had to pick just one takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
That's tough. I think the most important thing to remember is that educating women is an investment. It's an investment in a better future for everyone. It's not just about individual women. It's about creating a world where everyone has the chance to thrive.
And I love what the study says about diffusion. It gives us hope that this change can happen naturally. But we can't just sit around and wait for it. We all have a responsibility to support girls' education and create a more equitable and sustainable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to all our listeners out there, keep learning about this issue. Find out more about the amazing organizations doing this work, and find ways to get involved. Because when we empower girls, we empower the world.
That's the truth.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep making a difference.